Today's video was sponsored by Warner Brothers Games for Harry Potter Magic Awakened. Stay tuned to learn more. Oh man, no, it's happening again. Hi guys, I'm back with yet another new MMO announcement. This is getting out of hand. Seems the list of in-development MMOs gets larger every week. Will any of them release? Will those that do be any good? Tune in 10 years from now probably to find out. Okay, so the big news today is that there's a new Warhammer MMO in the works, which is honestly on its face like exciting for me because I think Warhammer is a great IP. There should absolutely be more games, more good games in particular, specifically more MMOs for both the 40k and fantasy iterations of Warhammer. And well, there's going to be, apparently. This is being made by Jackalyptic Games, a new studio led by Jack Emmerich, who's best known as the co-founder of Cryptic Studios and one of the main designers for City of Heroes, Neverwinter, Star Trek Online, DC Universe Online, and a few others, games I'm sure you've heard of. Emmerich has been involved in the development of many well-known MMOs over his career, and I'll say personally, I really enjoyed Neverwinter. Like, I played a bunch when it first released back in 2013. I thought the combat was really fun. I liked the world, the group content, the user-generated stuff. PvP was an awesome time. There was just a lot I enjoyed about Neverwinter in spite of the mess that became of its in-game cash shop. And I know there's a lot of people really fond of many of those games that I listed. I hear a lot of people speak highly of City of Heroes and Star Trek Online and DC Universe Online. Like, these are games might not have been the biggest blockbusters in the world, but they did well enough and they had fan bases. So what about this new upcoming one that he's working on? Well, this was initially revealed earlier in the year. In May, the studio put out a press release in which Emmerich said, "As someone who has molded my career developing expansive MMO stories, I'm proud to unveil that our first game in development at Jackalyptic Games will focus on the rich universes of Warhammer. Bringing the deep lore of this IP to our game is a massive undertaking, and we are thrilled to work alongside Games Workshop to bring this vision to life." Now, not much else was said in that initial release beyond them just reiterating that they would be working closely with Games Workshop throughout development and offering some basic information about the studio itself. Now, fortunately, there have been a ton of interviews in the months since, with Emmerich sitting down with various sites shedding more light on what we can expect from the project. And as you might expect and may have probably guessed, we'll get to that right after a word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Warner Brothers Games for Harry Potter Magic Awakened. This is an online role-playing game with MMO elements where players go out into the world, interact with each other, explore open-world areas, and can go out on adventures. Magic Awakened is also a collectible card game. You'll gather powerful spells, summons, and companions as cards that you can use in Dueling Club or when exploring the Forbidden Forest. In duels, you'll use the cards you've collected to unleash spells and magic creatures against your opponents. You can even team up with a partner in duo dueling. There are both casual and competitive PvP modes alongside the co-op PvE mode, or you can just chill in the social club, shoot some hoops in Quidditch practice, or take part in Harry Potter trivia. There's tons of customization for your dormitory, avatar, personal space, card skins, and effects. You can even record your own voice for incantations, and you'll explore the Forbidden Forest solo or with a couple of friends, going through several stages up to a final boss with a unique challenge and reward. Harry Potter Magic Awakened is available right now on iOS and Android. If you're interested in learning more, you can download the game with the link in the description below. Thanks again to Warner Brothers Games for sponsoring today's video. Okay, so let's talk about what we know about this new Warhammer MMO that we're probably not going to be playing for 5 or 6 years. So shortly after Jackalyptic Games revealed that they had this game in development, MMORPG.com posted an interview with Emmerich. Now, initially they asked, hey, Warhammer, it's a big IP, it means a lot to millions of people. What does it mean to have the first game from your new studio be based on such an iconic franchise? His response was, "We haven't specified the particular IP yet, but I can tell you as a longtime fan of everything Warhammer, I'm thrilled." Although the game is in the early stages, he did briefly generally talk about his vision for the Warhammer MMO and what players can expect. Mainly though, he said, "Hey, I can't really get into specifics, but I've tried with all of my games to be 100% authentic. Sure, we've had bugs and I've made a dumb design decision here and there, sure, yeah." But he said, "I've always loved the products I've made and played them incessantly. I'd like to think that a majority of fans have always understood that part of it." And you know what? That's something that I love to hear from a developer. There have been many times where you're playing games and you ask yourself, does the developer play this game? And it feels like a lot of times the answer to that question is no. Or if the answer is yes, that they don't play enough to particularly get into the weeds and the nitty-gritty of these various systems. This comes up time and time again, especially from the more hardcore player base. And you know, the monetization side of these games aside, which in many ways can be a different story, fueled by different incentives, different motivations, and different pressures where that funding is coming from, right? That stuff aside, you at least want to hear that the people making this game are going to be play it, that they have a history of playing the games that they're making, and more so that they have a history of playing them to the extent necessary to see any of those potential cracks in the foundation. Words only go so far, but that is a great thing to at least hear. Now, that was pretty much everything of interest that came out of that initial interview. It was pretty bare bones, to be frank, but about a week after that, he did a Q&A with WCCF Tech, going into quite a lot more detail. Good stuff in here. So first up, asked about what engine the Warhammer MMO would be using. He said, "We are pretty set on Unreal Engine 5. I think the days of creating our own engine are long over. 20 years ago, that just wasn't the case, so I think it was much more viable and in fact necessary to have your own game engine, but today there are clearly a lot more options." And you know, they went on to discuss with the recent release of UE 5.2 and how they have that procedural content generation framework built right in. That could really benefit the new MMO. Much in the same way, using procedural generated content works for a lot of open world games, helping with the creation of things like terrain, landscape, and flora at a large and or massive scale. Now, we know that it's going to be a Warhammer MMO. What we still don't know is which Warhammer. He was specifically asked about that. Is it going to be Warhammer Fantasy and not 40K? And his response was, no, it could be anything. It's not set yet. Or rather, it is set, but we are not announcing right now. It is something within the brand of Warhammer, whether that be Fantasy Old World, Age of Sigmar, 40K, or something else. It's something within the Warhammer umbrella. Honestly, I'll take everything. I do lean in the direction of I would love a new fantasy take on a Warhammer MMO. It's been tried before, didn't end up being terribly successful. I still thought there was plenty of merit to that game, but the original Warhammer MMO, obviously it's no longer, well, it is around, but only in private servers, but it's not officially supported anymore, so it clearly didn't do that well financially for them to continue officially supporting it. So I would love a fantasy Warhammer MMO. I'm also just more into fantasy personally. But that said, I'll take 40K as well. 40K is pretty darn cool. Space Marine's cool. Darktide was pretty cool. Having played and having these upcoming games or ones that recently released set within that 40K universe have made it pretty evident to me that yes, there could be a really good, there's certainly a good foundation for what could be a really cool 40K MMO based on just the glimpses within the universe in the video game sphere that we've seen. I'll take anything. Fantasy, 40K, whatever. Warhammer MMO, period. Sounds pretty good to me. Now, Emmerich also went on to say that one of the main goals with this game is to share the rich lore and history of Warhammer with the masses, and also at the same time trying to make a game that's accessible to anybody, whether or not they're familiar with Warhammer. They could just sit down and play. So he said specifically, that's been a consistent theme through much of my career, trying, sometimes poorly, to make sure that I'm allowing the game to be enjoyed by the greatest number of people. At the end of the day, I view any game that I make as a chance for someone to escape for an hour or 2 hours a day to dive into another world. I don't want to overwhelm anyone with game mechanics and requirements. I just want them to sit down and enjoy themselves. So I think that is another area of focus. And I think as a general design philosophy, that is certainly a good one. I also think striking the balance between accessibility, approachability, whether that's to the IP or to the game itself and the mechanics and the world and how you interact with the world, striking the balance between make it easy to get into, but then have that depth and complexity for the late game, for the end game systems, for the people who want to invest month after month after month. They can get something out of it, same as the people who are just going to jump in for a few weeks, leave, and come back for updates. It's really interesting personally. I found myself in both camps throughout my lifetime as a gamer. There have been plenty of times where I have been that obsessively playing player, interested in just the one game and wanting those deep end game systems that are still engaging hundreds and thousands of hours down the road. But nowadays, I'm way more nomadic with my game playing, as I've reiterated on this channel time and time again. I'm just more interested in getting a taste of the game, playing the experience, trying to see everything it has to offer, and then not grind it into the ground. That's just, again, personally where I am with games. So try to, if you can, cater to both. Now, in terms of combat, it seems like they are going to be planning more of an action focus versus the old school tab targeting. Emmerich said, I'm not sure I'll ever go back to doing a more traditional MMO. Maybe one day I will, but I don't think so. After the the games that I've done, from Neverwinter to DC Universe Online, and of course the Cancel project. He's talking about what he had in development at, I believe it was Daybreak Games, before he left that company and founded this new one. He said, "I've mainly focused on games with more fluid combat than what I created when I first entered the industry years ago." And what he created when he first entered the industry years ago were those more traditional old school tab target games. Things like, I can at least speak personally from having played Neverwinter, it was like an action hybrid. I do believe they still had soft lock targeting, but it was the case where you would have almost like an FPS game where as you swung the mouse, the characters aiming moved around and you had to line up a crosshair with your target in order to hit them. There were still area abilities, there were still cleave abilities, but you nevertheless were aiming at your targets. Now, how he or this game is going to approach that sort of action combat, if it would be like Neverwinter, if it would be more kind of action RPG style, if we're talking MMOs in the vein of something like New World, or if they would go that soft lock combat, which again is what we saw in Neverwinter, we see in like Guild Wars 2 or the Elder Scrolls Online. They both have like soft lock. It's kind of like an action tab target hybrid. Sounds like they're not going to do traditional old school tab target at the very least. And one thing I'm really interested by from this interview was their discussion about the business model. Speaking of business model and what sort of business model he would expect from the MMO, he said, "Several years ago, I would have thought that free-to-play was the best option. I think the success of a game like New World has demonstrated that you can do straight-up buy-to-play. I do think that there's room for a subscription-like system like Fortnite has done with the Battle Pass, while I'm not sure whether a traditional monthly fee would be as successful today. But there are options available that I didn't think were possible up until New World launched. I wasn't entirely sure that one could successfully just sell a box and really make enough revenue. Obviously, that one did quite well. I will admit it's kind of a regular back and forth and debate that I have with myself as to the best business model for an MMO. On one hand, I totally get that when you have a free-to-play MMO, that instantly makes it way more available to way more people. It is more likely that you're going to have a much larger player base if your game has a very low barrier to entry. But the fact of the matter is, yes, as it has bore out time and time again with these free-to-play MMOs, a lot of times they will in turn have some really rough monetization off of the back of being free-to-play. Now, that doesn't mean that a game that's buy-to-play doesn't also have and isn't heavily monetized. Many times we are seeing that as well. We're seeing those two things in conjunction. You got a base box price, you got a cosmetic shop, you got a season pass, you got all of the monetization. Maybe throw in some gamba in there, do some loot boxes, although nowadays it's mostly just gacha, but gacha is pretty much also loot boxes, just by a different name. But yes, just because you have a box price doesn't mean you're not heavily monetized. But if you are free to play, you're pretty much guaranteeing that the game is going to be heavily monetized. So it's for that reason alone that I do hope, and I want to see more games that do have a box price, because I think that lends the higher likelihood that the extra monetization won't be as egregious, or at least it's more possible. Whereas with a free-to-play game, you're pretty much guaranteeing that monetization is going to be heavily, just really bad, honestly. Maybe pushing into the pay-to-convenience, the pay-to-win, and all of those things that we bring up time and time again here on the channel. Is there a perfect monetization model? Well, yes, actually, sure, there is. Box price and that's it. That's the perfect monetization model as far as I'm concerned. But that ship has sailed, and that's just not where we're at. But we'll see what they decide to do with this Warhammer MMO. Now, lastly, at the end of this particular interview, they were asked, hey, when are we going to get something concrete like a teaser trailer for this new game? And the response was, I couldn't tell you. I'm still hard at work in the investigation phase. Let's put it that way. So unfortunately, I can't give any more details. You know, investigation phase sure sounds like pre-active development. So to set the expectations, this is another game that's like 5, 6, 7 years down the road. That is where we're at. I know you might want to stop hearing about it, but there were some more other interesting things just recently, like in just the other week. We got a pair of interviews out of wargamer.com. And what I liked about these is they talked about the genre in general. And I think this gives us a good insight into what they might be doing and what they're thinking about with this particular MMO. A lot could change in the next 5 to 7 years though, but let's see what we're thinking here. So he was asked about the scope of MMOs in 2023. Emmerich responded with, after World of Warcraft, people tried to copy World of Warcraft, and in doing so, they tried to compete with World of Warcraft, which meant investing a lot of money, which then required a lot of profit. It required a massive success bigger than Warcraft. And when they didn't achieve that, because of course they didn't, most of the major publishers gave up on MMOs. To this day, we live in a world where in the West, there are very few MMOs. From the perspective of the genre, I would say there's still a demand. New World came out, and and quadrillions of copies were sold, well above 10 million, which is amazing, which tells me that there are people who want to play an MMO, but there's nobody making them. Amen, brother, preach it. That is absolutely, positively the case. We saw the gold rush chasing WoW, people trying to emulate or just straight up copy WoW's formula and failing to do so because that game had an established base. It had the benefit of having lore and people loving the Warcraft universe, built a good game, and that game just got bigger. It was successful. Success begot more success, and you couldn't compete with that. You can't launch an MMO today that tries to do exactly what WoW does and has as much content because WoW is coming up on 20 years old now at this point. But even within the 3 to 5 years following WoW's release, when that initial success happened and people tried to jump in right away, turn these MMOs around and try to copy it, it didn't work. We saw it. There's a graveyard of failed MMOs in the wake of what they were trying to do in chasing World of Warcraft. But there is still absolutely a thirst, a desire for this genre that goes without question. And yes, I do think that New World really proved that. That game came out and set all sorts of records, set concurrency records, set viewership records, sold a lot of copies. This is the first time I had seen an exact number, but apparently according to Emirates, above 10 million copies were sold. Do the math, they made a lot of money off of that, and that was before their implementation. I do believe New World now does have a season pass, by the way, but it didn't when it launched, just if my memory serves me correct. Either way, though, there is clearly still a base and an audience, and I think we are just sitting here waiting for more developers to take a stab at it, and it's happening. It is absolutely happening. Sure, we got this Warhammer MMO, but this is coming from a new studio. Who knows how that'll turn out? But on top of that, we got Blizzard making a survival MMO. We got Sony making an MMO with the Horizon thing. We've got MMOs coming from Riot. There's like a lot of these big name companies working on MMOs right now. ZeniMax Online Studios, the people who make ESO, they're making a new MMO as well. So there is a audience for it, and I think finally developers are starting to realize this, and we are seeing those games coming. I can't wait because yes, there's certainly a desire. There is a desire there. There is a market there to be captured. As much as a lot of people are still playing the old MMOs, people still playing WoW and Black Desert and Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2 and ESO, Albion Online, old school RuneScape, all these games, we want something new. There's always an interest in something new, and an interest in something that it would be great if it came along and captured our attention and sort of re-sparked that magic, as I talked about in the recent MMO video that I made. So he was asked about what defines an MMO for you. I found this interesting. Emirates said an MMO is a game where you can play with other people and you can always progress. There's no end point, no matter how small. It's a game that you can make progress in any given night, week, or month. By progress, I mean make your character more powerful. Yeah, and that is part of the equation. There's having always something to progress and work towards with your character, with your account, whatever. I think just as much, if not more so, to me, big elements of MMOs include things like the open world, like having that social interaction, even if it's just coming across other players and seeing other players in your world, seeing other players at public events or world bosses, but then also having an immersive space that's interesting to spend time in, interesting to explore, and having gameplay that makes that entire process feel really satisfying. I think all of these are pretty pivotal and vital when it comes to what we are defining an MMO as. All right, two other big things from this interview. Talking about modern technology and how that can play into the structure of an MMO. I found this really interesting. Emirates said, I would love to see a world where you can create truly dynamic, interconnected setting so that you can just roll it out and players' interactions with it create random events. So for example, if there's an orc tribe in the hills and players kill a bunch of them because the farmers gave them a quest to do it, there are no more orcs. Unfortunately, the orcs were the only things that were keeping in place the dark elves in the caverns underneath, so then all of a sudden the dark elves come out. 10 years ago, that would have been an impossible thing to create. Famously, EverQuest Next wanted to do some of this stuff, but EverQuest Next was canceled precisely because it's just impossible, but I think we can get there. And I think this idea of dynamic events and dynamic interactions is interesting. It's actually something that Ashes of Creation is trying to do. Yes, famously, EverQuest Next was talking about it. I think as long as it's more than just a phasing change, right? Where you know, I've got the quest to kill the orcs, I go kill the orcs, I turn in the quest, and then phasing happens and magically it's infested with the dark elves. Having these dynamic interactions with all of these systems at play, where it's really happening, where if a large volume of players kills all of the orcs in whatever the parameters are, like a certain number of kills within a set window, and then that exterminates the orcs. Pretty morbid, but it exterminates the orcs, and then the dark elves creep in because they're no longer fighting with the orcs. It's a cool idea. If it's done well, I think it sounds difficult and challenging to do well. I think it also sounds very challenging to not have the player base completely ruin the game with these kind of systems, depending on how big these systems are. What if you destroy everything that was fighting the Dark Elves, and then all of a sudden your entire game is just the Dark Elf faction? Right? Like what? Although I guess in this circumstance, if there was nothing left but Dark Elves and players had nothing to kill but Dark Elves, eventually you would kill enough Dark Elves so that the orcs returned. Maybe they come in on Zeppelins or something. I don't know how they get back. It's complicated. God bless anyone trying to develop a system like this and not have it be completely destroyed by the player base as well. And finally, PvP in an MMO. Emmerich talked about it. He said, I have never emphasized PvP. God bless all the games that depend upon it. I don't know how to do it. If I play a PvP game and I lose several times in a row, I don't want to play anymore, right? Like getting your head beaten isn't necessarily fun. And so you end up winnowing down your population. PvP is not and will never be a focus of mine probably for the rest of my career. Although he is saying it is not a focus, I do hope that the game still has PvP in it. I think especially with the Warhammer IP, having competition with other players sounds like a pretty big thing that I would like to see in the game. Nevertheless, the last Warhammer MMO that was focused on PvP, it no longer exists. Again, besides private servers, it no longer exists officially. And I do agree with him in the sense that, boy, if you punish players too hard by getting griefed by other players, and if PvP is too much of a focus, and if there's too much punishment, either through loss of time or through loss of actual resources or items, yeah, you do end up winnowing down your player base. We see this a lot in survival games. Originally, New World was supposed to be this, but through their focus testing, they realized they just ended up with no one playing the game because people got tired of being farmed. I will say it is a difficult thing to do, but I will also say, as much as I have loved and admire PvP in my MMOs, and I have great memories of the PvP in every MMO that I've played and engaged in PvP with, I do know that ultimately, when I look at the total amount of time that I've spent with every MMO that I've played over these years, the PvP is but a fraction of the time, because eventually I get to the point where I just want to do the PvE thing. I just want to explore. I just want to do the dungeons. Especially the case when you have MMOs that have a long tail, that have a long lifespan. Every time I come back to MMOs that I've played over the years, every time I come back to ESO, to Guild Wars 2, to WoW, my incentive to jump into PvP gets smaller with every passing year because I feel so far behind. The player base in terms of the knowledge, having to know the arenas, having to know the various PvP systems that get updated, but specifically having to learn every single class interaction, having to learn what every class does and being able to respond to that as time goes on and updates happen and classes change. It's just so intimidating beyond the player skill of the people that you're fighting against when you have games that are 10 or 15 or 20 years old, also having to keep up with all the changes. Like, what are the abilities that they have now? How do I anticipate them? How do I counter them? How do I respond to them? It's just a huge barrier to entry, whereas PvE is just like, yeah, you just kill the stupid AI. And then when you did kill that one, you go kill the other one. You get loot that makes you better at killing the harder AI. Like, it's just so much more straightforward. So yeah, I love PvP, but PvP games exist. And I think this is largely what we have seen in the industry, a splintering of this focus. And I think for the most part, it's become pretty clear that the MMOs that are the most successful are successful because of their casual content and because of their PvE content, not because of their competitive PvP content. And anytime I've ever seen numbers about games that have all of these things on offer, they have PvE, casual stuff, in PvP, it always seems to be the case that whenever the developer talks about the total number of player base who engage in PvP, it's somewhere between 5 and 10%. It is a very low percentage over the total number of players. So that alone makes it pretty clear, at least in the games that have been developed thus far. Maybe one day we get an MMO that's full PvP focus and people love it and it keeps growing. As of this point, PvP takes the back burner when it comes to this particular genre as a whole. That can of course change, but it doesn't seem like it is going to change with this Warhammer MMO because Emmerich isn't particularly interested in the PvP side of things. And with that pretty much does it for this video. While I know, and as I've said, we are a very long ways away from ever getting to play this game, if it even ever comes out, I still nevertheless love I mean, it's what I do, right? I talk about games, I play the games that I'm interested in, I talk about the games that I'm interested in, and this genre in particular, MMOs, I'm just a huge fan of. So anytime we hear about a new one in development, I'll probably share it with you if it piques my interest even a little bit. So yes, this Warhammer MMO, there's some information about it. See you in 7 years if this is the only game you're interested in. That is going to do it today. I, of course, want to thank once again Warner Brothers Games for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to check out their game, Harry Potter Magic Awakened, using the link in the description below. But that just about does it. Thank you as always for watching. Hope you enjoyed the vid, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy.